Well, you're standing up? Yeah, I'm standing up. I don't know if this is gonna make things any better, but at the very least, being able to move around like this a little may help with me processing my thoughts, so we'll just give this a try, see if it makes things any different. For those of you who've been following the channel for quite a while now, you might already know this, but I've been working in the Japanese game industry for quite a few years now, and of course that also means that across the time I had to work on gacha games a few times in the past. Now, mostly working on development instead, but even then, while I'm not working specifically on live ops or gacha games, I do still try to keep as informed as possible about the industry because the thing changes quite a lot. And I think one of the stories that has interested me the most in this last few years is probably Blue Archive as well. One thing I found very interesting about the story of this series, and this is something that many of my colleagues and ex-colleagues can agree to as well, is the fact that with Blue Archive, we really have the story of a game which ended up being quite an anomaly in its own unique way. And I don't mean anomaly in the sense of a Nikkei or a Genshin where they released, they exploded in popularity, had a bunch of weird controversies, and then still managed to remain popular to this day. Rather, for Blue Archive, you kind of had a very different one in the sense that this game might actually be the biggest comeback story I've ever heard of in the entire industry till this day. For those of you who do not know what Blue Archive is, it's a strategy RPG gacha game on the mobile platform set in a world where they basically found a way to get around the whole school shooting issue by arming every single student and making them immune to bullets and explosives, so you can't really kill anyone as a result. But even then, there's betrayal, there's bank robberies, there's gangs, there's violence, all of the stuff all set on a relatively cute waifu backdrop. This game was produced by Net Games, the subsidiary of Nexon, which in spite of that, it actually did surprisingly quite well, both in terms of how friendly it is towards the players as well as to how much popularity it got. Though before we get into actually talking about the history of the game itself, there's some stuff I wanna just put out here just to be as transparent as possible with you guys about the sources of the data I'm using. For one thing, I can't directly name some of the sources I'm using due to the fact that I'm basically using some of the tools that we have within the industry to look at how our competitors are doing. So at the bottom of the page for that tool itself, it kind of does say that confidential information, do not disclose. So I don't really want to break the NDA itself. That and the fact that these tools, like most of the free tools that do exist as well, are all largely just estimates. So every single tool you use, including the free ones, they will all give you different results to some extent due to the fact that they're all basically just guesstimating the result itself and basically just showing you values based off of what they managed to gather. I can link you guys to some of the tools that many companies use. I'll put them in the bottom, but at the same time, I won't be using exact values, so I won't be telling you like the game sold $4,200 or something, because of the fact that it really doesn't make sense for me to give you guys a number when there is no way for us to know verifiably which number is the truest. That is something that only Nexon themselves will probably know. But at the very least, I can try to give you guys the closest estimates that exist out there. With that out of the way, let's get into the main subjects of today's video. How did Blue Archive do when it initially launched? I feel like I've kind of already spoiled that to some extent, but we'll go more into detail in the rest of this video, so just don't worry about it. How did Blue Archive manage to get out of the near EOS situation it was in its initial phase? And how did they cause one of the biggest comebacks we've seen in recent years? Let's find out together! So, Blue Archive began service on the 4th of February 2021. This was during the height of the pandemic where many companies and people were still trying to adapt to working from home at the time. So, game industry, especially mobile games, were booming because many people didn't really have good home setups for PC gaming either. And Blue Archive was no exception. Its first month, it actually did pretty well for a game with no backing IP like an FGO or something like that. Yeah, you kind of do have Nexon's name tied to the title, but arguably I would say that's typically more of a crutch than it is a benefit when you consider Nexon's track record, so not the best. But even then, this was a game that in its initial month actually managed to get into the top 30 in sales when compared to just other games on the mobile platform. And if you compare it to all apps that had monetization in general, it was still within the top 40. Pretty respectable numbers, not as crazy as something like a Nikkei, but it didn't have the level of humorism that that game had, so it's perfectly understandable that it didn't get into the top 10 the way Nikkei did. But what was very drastic for Blue Archive was the level of fall off that it saw after the first month, dropping out of the top 100 within the second month and out of the top 200 within the third month. And it for the most part hovered around the 150th to 250th position on the sales rankings from all the data that I've looked at. In comparison, when you look at something like Nikkei, for example, while it did see a drop off after the first month as well, it did manage to maintain its position within the top 50 for almost the entirety of its existence till now. So you can see that there is at least some level of consistency that it will maintain if a title wants to do well. In fact, it was doing so badly at points for Blue Archive that there were actually periods where the game was doing as well as Mahjong Souls in terms of profitability, which is not a very good sign, especially when you consider the amount of development costs that will go into something like Blue Archive. And even when it reached its first anniversary, it did not manage to break into the top 100 in the sales rankings, which is pretty bad because this implies that the game is not even able to hit about 50% of the sales that it had hit on its first month of launch, which for most successful titles that managed to survive for many years going forward, the trend you would see is that there will always be a drop-off after the first month, but typically even for the first anniversary, while the game will never hit the first month's worth of sales ever again, it tends to at least hit somewhere above the 50% mark, maybe somewhere between 75 to 50. And when I looked at the average of all the different sources of data I had pulled up for its sales within the first year, it really did paint quite a dire picture of where Blue Archive was initially. Like in comparison, this game was essentially doing about half the sales of what Memento Mori did in its first year, and doing a fifth of what Nikkei had managed to accomplish as well, so that's not a very good outlook for its survivability into the long term, since when you look at the trend of how most other games that actually manage to survive past their first anniversary and the second anniversary typically do, they tend to be earning maybe double, even triple, maybe more of this, more often than not. Especially when you consider the fact that the game was basically produced under Nexon, there's a very real chance that they would just cut it short and end it off because of how poorly it was performing compared to pretty much most of their successful titles do, which would severely hamper their ability to maintain the level of production that they would have wanted, especially when you consider how expensive it can get trying to produce 2 new 3D model characters every 2 weeks. Even if it's a chibi model, that shit ain't cheap. And when you look at the state of the game itself at the time, I guess it wasn't too much of a surprise that it was falling in this way either. For those of you who didn't play Blue Archive in its initial release, like I did play it for a bit during the first 2 months before I dropped it and came back like sometime after the first anniversary, but at the time, the game was a complete shit show. Like, let's be real, right? If you're watching this, you'll probably like the series, but I'm sure you and I can both accept it. Especially the people who were there for the initial release. You definitely knew that this was the case. The game back then was a literal shit show. Like, firstly, the game was so bug-ridden when it initially launched that it was actually a miracle that people were even able to play the game in the first place, because of the fact that there were literally people whose games were just unable to load in at all. They just couldn't log in, and that was a bug that persisted for quite a while, it seems. Like, if you look at the page of all the maintenances and all of the bug fixes that happened during each maintenance, you would notice that every single week there were bug fixes with this game. Like, just everything that could go wrong probably did go wrong. This game was the literal embodiment of the... what's it called again? The Smith's Rule? Smith's Law? In a way, you could say that this game was the living embodiment of Murphy's Law at a time where everything that could go wrong basically managed to go wrong. There was another one they announced where the terrain bonus for special students apparently just wasn't correctly reflected as well, although the full details are a bit of a mystery for that one. The in-game schedule function also apparently managed to bug to some extent. There were people who couldn't enter the cafe within the game, which is where you go to collect all of your free stuff that stocks up every single day. Even the hitbox on the buttons on the menu were wrong. Like, according to people online, since the original post from the Blue Archive official Twitter didn't actually show how the hitboxes were like, according to them, it actually looked something like this, and this resulted in there being maintenances pretty much on a weekly basis just to fix bugs. And these maintenances weren't like just, oh, we're just gonna close the game for 3 to 4 hours so that we can fix the shit that's going wrong with it. No, there was actually a maintenance that lasted for 50 hours as well. And basically, if you talk to many of the people who played the game at the time during its initial launch, most of them were stacked with so many gems that they didn't know what to do with it, which just sounds like a very good thing, you know. More maintenances, more gems, more free-to-playness for the players. It sounds like it would be a good thing, but first up, that does hurt the profitability of the company quite a bit, right? So making the game sustainable will be difficult when people aren't spending at all. And secondly, and this one may not be as intuitive to many people, but just the idea of having a maintenance is enough to dent a game's DAU. Like, even if all you did was the regular short maintenance, right, like 3 to 4 hours, maybe somewhere in the mid-afternoon, that is enough for many titles to just lose 5% of their DAU, just like that. It is to the point that many titles out there now are basically trying to either minimize the number of times that they have to even do a maintenance in the first place. You can look at stuff like Star Rail, for example. They've been trying to cut it down and make the updates last as long as possible so that they can minimize the amount of time spent in maintenance in the first place. You have Bandai Namco trying something weird with the new Idolmaster game where even while you're downloading the data from the maintenance, you can already start playing the game, so they can minimize the amount of downtime where the player can't touch the game. And the reason why companies are so desperate to do this is because of the fact that the DAU drop, it really just is that bad for many games out there. If you want to maintain your DAU, you try to minimize maintenances. So the fact that Blue Archive essentially needed weekly maintenances, not good for the DAU. As you can imagine, it would basically kill off the DAU of everyone other than the people who really want this game to succeed and who really love this title. Secondly, for a game whose main monetization method was the gacha, it certainly had a very piss poor gacha for its time. So for those of you who didn't know, the gacha's rates were initially modeled off Princess Connect, as were many things within this game, but with this game, while it did have the same 2.5% that Princess Connect had, nowadays you look at it as 3%. You might think like, oh, but that's just fine, it's 2.5, it's still better, or at least within average for most games which are between 2 to 3. But unlike many titles out there, especially the title that it was benchmarked to, Princess Connect, this game actually required you to roll 300 times instead to get a spark. For those of you who are, pity, I forgot the terminology is different in English nowadays. For Princess Connect, it had been 200 from the start, so the fact that they actually increased the requirement of the player to roll for another 100 pulls does make things a lot more problematic for the player, especially when you consider the fact that in terms of the value of the paid currency within both of these games, they were more or less equal in terms of the value that you were getting from it. So you basically had to pay more in Blue Archive as compared to Princess Connect in order to guarantee the character if you were very unlucky. Which that alone was enough to turn off many people, since for people, especially FP players, you probably would want to play a game where you actually have a decent chance of getting the stuff you want. And with a 300 pull and the frequency of gem giveouts excluding the compensation for maintenances, it really did make it very difficult for F2P players to actually feel like they were able to keep up in this game at all. Plus, when you consider the fact that when initially Uma Musume first released, it was at 3% instead, that even more just took away from Blue Archive, since you basically had a more friendly alternative that existed right off the bat as well. And before you say something like, oh, but FGO is 1%, look, okay, we don't talk about that game, okay? I don't think there has been anything that has been as successful and simultaneously cursed as that game has been. Also, remember Ellipse, the thing that you get whenever you roll on the gacha and you get a dupe of the character, and you would basically get the fragments, which are the generic one, and the specific character ones as well. You did not get the character specific ones on top of the generic ones, which felt a little bizarre as well, since this was something that the game that they were benchmarked off of, and many other titles that came out after also had. And the removal of this just made it even harder to actually awaken the characters. And because of the fact that all of this made the character raising look even more difficult, since you needed to roll even more in order to get enough fragments to do anything, it probably drove people away as well, as it made the game feel more pay to win instead. That, and number 3, the game, especially in the very first few months of release, had a very unstable event cycle. So you want to make the best impression that you can on the player base at the start of the game's release, right? You don't want people to think that your game is gonna die or it's just complete garbage or something, because once people get that in their mind that your game is not good, they're probably going to start spreading that as well, and it's going to be even harder for you to capture players coming into the game in the future as well. So the first few months are obviously very important as a result. But for this game, for Blue Archive initially, you got your first event somewhere around the end of February, which yeah, that's about fine. You know, a game taking maybe like 2 weeks before it releases its first event. Most games do that. It's pretty general that you would like put 1 or 2 weeks for people to first get through the normal content before throwing in the first event. But the thing with Blue Archive was that they had the first event there, and then it just stopped. Like, there was just nothing. Like, the whole of March went by, you got nothing. Half of April went by, you got jack shit. End of April, finally your second event was there. Like, that's a very big gap with basically players having barely anything to do. Like, yeah, they kind of did have total assaults and all that, but at the same time, that's like, what, 1 week of somewhat doable content that you do like 3 times in a day and then you just fuck off from it. And total assault was pretty much your end game content more so than anything else. So you just like, you don't have a middle ground of like the constant cycle of new characters, new events that most games would have had to basically keep players attracted and interested in the game, with all of the event stories, the fun stuff, new characters, then all of that being usable in the total assaults and all that. Instead, not only did the events basically just stop at the time, but they actually just ended up recycling the character banners as well. So you really didn't get many new characters during this first few months as well. Like, you look at the standard out there for most companies nowadays, right? It's like, what, one banner every 2 weeks. That's the minimum you're gonna want to do to be able to keep the attention of your players and constantly give them something new to want to work towards, and then a new goal to work towards once they actually acquire the character. So yeah, having big gaps like that of instability at the start, not leaving the best impression. If anything, you're probably gonna cause players to think that this game is gonna end service soon when you have like issues like that happening. So the fact that the DAU dropped massively after the first month as a result of stuff like this, kind of understandable. Fourthly, and this ties back to the total assault I mentioned before, where total assault is essentially the game's PvE PvP. So a PvP ranking thing where you basically compete with each other instead by actually doing well in a PvE setting. So something like a speed run of a game, except that now you need to spend upwards of a few $1,000s in order to do well in the speed run. But the reason why it was not as popular back then, and why many people actually disliked it, is that in spite of the fact that they did try to incorporate gimmicks into it, the earlier bosses were still pretty simplistic and brain dead, and they used to be a lot more RNG in whether or not you could actually get to the top. Now, granted, I know that nowadays it's still kind of RNG, right? You want to do well in Horde, you kind of need to do the towerless thing, and that's its own can of worms in terms of being the kind of sweat lord who can get that to happen consistently if at all possible. But when you look at the earlier bosses for the game, right, stuff like Bina, for example, there really wasn't very much in the ways of gimmicks that you really had to deal with. Shirokuro as well, you kind of do have the whole gimmick with the whole ball rebounding thing, but at the same time, you have to remember that back then when it first released, the game was only up to extreme difficulty, which we've come a long way with all the additional difficulties with the additional gimmicks and all, but back then, really, the gimmicks weren't as important as they are now, and a lot of whether or not you did well in most of these really just boiled down to whether or not your Iori would crit well enough. And because of the fact that you had to reset quite a lot, but many of the QOL features didn't exist at the time, it also meant that it was a very high stress situation even trying to compete in the rankings, because things like being able to select the first 3 skills that will pop up when you first enter the map, stuff like this, back then you couldn't actually do it. So in order to do well, you basically had to sit there and just constantly push the reset button until you got the right series of cards appearing, and the cards that came after came in the right order as well, which made it very difficult to line up stuff as is. And then on top of that, you basically still have to ensure that your skills crit. So very sweaty, a lot more so than now. Probably enough sweat to fill up the entirety of the Dead Sea, but yeah, it also would mean that it would have caused a lot of stress for the players back in the day. And so that in and of itself, while it was supposed to be the end game content and the thing that basically players would compete for and that should have been interesting to play through, it ended up being not so much so. Nowadays, you look at the newer bosses, they actually are quite interesting with their own gimmicks, with different ways to deal with different bosses, right? Different strokes for different kings and all that. But suffice to say, back then it was a lot more restrictive, which meant that really there wasn't much incentive to prep as many characters, and even when you did, it didn't feel very rewarding to be able to clear the higher difficulties as well, because really, at that point, you were just dice rolling the entirety of the stage. And lastly, even when it came to the first anniversary, right, the best chance they had to try to bring the game back up to speed, where you could basically do a lot of very grand shit, put in a lot of very entertaining and rewarding stuff to try and attract new players into the game and keep the old players playing. It just ended up being pretty mid. Like, it was so mid that I feel like they could have given Genshin a run for their money for having the most lackluster first anniversary ever. For example, when it came to the free polls they gave away during their anniversary, right? Every game nowadays, they do it because the metrics of not doing it and looking like a very stingy company is way worse than the slight amounts of losses you will get from it. Especially when you consider the fact that many people would take this as an opportunity to enter and start picking up the game. In a way, you can consider it a marketing cost as well. Not too much of a loss to begin with, so most companies just generally do it. And Blue Archive did have it as well, except that it was only one pool a day. Like, when you consider the fact that at the time they had already improved the gacha such that it was 200 for a spark or a pity instead of 300, that's a great improvement. But one pool a day is a very bad metric, especially when the game that they would get benchmarked against the most, which is Princess Connect, was already doing 10 pull every day for the anniversaries. And even when you look at the rest of the stuff they were giving out during the anniversary, you could tell that they were just giving out a lot less as well. Like, we can put aside materials that are used for raising characters, cause those are a lot harder to compare between games. But when you look at the paid currency itself, during the year of 2022, Princess Connect had its 4th anniversary and they gave out a total of, at the minimum, 75 pulls worth of gems. The reason why it's minimum is because of the fact that they gave out 50 that were fixed, and then they gave out through a randomized login bonus where you basically had like mini horse racing going on in the login bonus, except with Princess Connect characters instead. Anywhere between 250 to 500 gems a day, so the minimum you could have gotten was 3,750 gems, which was 25 pulls. That is still more than what Blue Archive gave out, as Blue Archive essentially gave out 10 pulls worth of gems for the live stream, and another 30 more pulls worth of both gems and 2 temple tickets. Because Blue Archive essentially gave out 10 pulls worth of gems for the live stream, another 10 pulls worth of gems in the login bonus, and 2 temple tickets to a total of 40. So almost half of what Princess Connect had given out. And I know what some of you might think, right? Like, Princess Connect was its 4th anniversary, they obviously have a lot more money at hand. It's a more established title, they should be doing more. But arguably, I would say that considering the fact that Blue Archive needed to turn the game's performance around and actually attract more people in, they should have at least been trying to keep up with the titles that they would have been compared with during that period. Because when you look at the tool at this point, if you were someone who really loved playing this type of games, you would kind of see like right off the bat that there was a very big disparity between the two, and will make it a lot harder for people to want to pick your game when other games are being that much friendlier instead. This should have been when they should have tried their best to actually try to turn things around by doing a little more for the players on the 1st anniversary, right? Give them a little bit more of a head start or an edge so that people will actually be willing to come in and play the game instead of going to their competitors. But in the end, they didn't really do it. It could have been due to issues with the way that Nexon's top management had dealt with it perhaps, but suffice to say, because of that, the game just didn't perform very well during its anniversary. Which makes it even more worrying because as I'm looking at the data here, by the time it got to like June of 2022, the DAU had fallen below the initial amount before the 1st anniversary, meaning that bit by bit, as with most gacha games which are slowly like losing relevancy, its DAU was also starting to decay, which also means that its already lackluster performance during the 1st anniversary would never be hit again if the company's progress had continued the way it did at the time. So you might then be wondering, well, then what changed? If the game was at its 1st anniversary doing so badly that it looked like it was cratering towards EOS at max speed at this point, why didn't that happen and how did they turn it around? So here's something that might be interesting to some of you guys, right? Because I did know people who used to think like this as well, which is that, oh yeah, while Japan, Korea, China, they do have very high spending propensities, right? Like the average player there spends a lot more on games with monetization, especially gacha, and loot boxes than the average person does in the rest of the world. But by sheer size and volume, right, you have Japan, which has a declining population. Korea isn't that massive to begin with. China is about to head into its own like population crisis as well. These countries, while they might be big, they shouldn't be able to eclipse the entire world's spending when it comes to this kind of game, right? Well, maybe China could. I mean, like the way people spend there is quite insane. But at the very least, Japan, Korea shouldn't be able to, right? But the funny thing is that for many titles out there, the Japanese versions of the game tend to actually do as well as global, if not better. With FGO, it's actually a 50-50. Now, I get what you want to say, right, some of you. That, like, yeah, but, like, not everyone who plays the Japanese version of the game is from Japan. And you're absolutely right. The average is around 25 to 30% come from outside of Japan. I've seen the stats across multiple companies or across multiple games. It's typically around there. That was pretty much the case this time as well, yeah? What, did you honestly believe that I was gonna tell you that Global actually did better than both Korea and Japan?
Get out of here!
You know that's never gonna happen. Especially with a game made by Nexon, since Nexon as a company, their impression outside of Korea is really way worse. Especially in the rest of the world where, since global Nexon is actually a way more exploitative than Korean Nexon, people in general, especially in the more English speaking parts of the world, just tend to have a much worse impression of Nexon in general. But even then, it's not like Global's performance was completely horrible. It was about 50% of JP, which is fine. That's about how much you would expect them to do. Korea did actually do 1.5 times of JPs. But more importantly, what this also does mean is that when you combine the total revenues for the KR and Global version together, you essentially see the team that was running Blue Archive suddenly getting an injection of cash that was double what the JP version had gotten in its first month of release. And looking at the numbers that I have here, the estimates, it was about 66% there, about 2/3 of what the JP version had made in the first 6 months, earned within just the first month of both these versions releasing alone. Which I don't know how much they actually invested into the localization for both of these versions of the game. From my own personal experience, localization, it's not something that's very cheap, but it's not that costly either. And if you know how much you expect your game to earn, it's very easy to plan the localization around that. So if they expected Global and KR to do about equal to JP, even then, the fact that the costs are set to that level of revenue also does mean that they will be earning way much more in terms of profits that could then be reinvested into the game, since the cost would be more than covered for at this point. With Blue Archive, you kind of could see that they actually did reinvest a lot of that, albeit not all of it into the game itself, more into the experience of the IP in general. But as we go on into the next part of the video, you can kind of see where the money more or less went. That said, with the spending propensity of people within Asia, particularly Japan and Korea, as the game got more popular over time, for sure both of the servers ended up pulling ahead, with the Japanese server now being massively ahead of the other two in terms of total sales revenue as well as DAU, which is a little more what you would expect nowadays still, but even then it was pretty amazing to see that in the game's earlier days, it was the rest of the world pulling this game up instead. So let me ask you guys, right, what do you think is the most important thing in creating a successful mobile game title? Is it having a good core game? Is it good planning of your life ops? Or is it treating your players well? No doubt, all of these are all very important things, and these are the factors that would ensure that people, after they've adopted your game, are more likely to stay on and play for the long term, right? There are many titles that have shown this. If you do all of this right, you treat your players well, you give them good content, and your game is fun, no doubt people will stay. But especially if you've talked to many indie developers as well, what you would know is that for the game to become successful, to blow up in the first place, the most important thing is of course marketing. Which feels a little weird and annoying to say as a developer, but it just do be that way. Right, without marketing of any form, no matter how good your game is, if people don't know it exists, it's gonna be very hard for you to shine, especially if your game is very new, or you are in a company that doesn't have a very big track record in the first place. Or in the case of Blue Archive, if you have a game which has a pretty negative reputation in its initial launch. Because if you think about it, mobile game companies, they're kind of like Coca-Cola in a way, right? They're both giving you diabetes, except that instead of pumping raw sugar into your blood vessels, they're just giving you a sweetness overdose with all of the different waifus in the game. And they're also very dependent on marketing to maintain relevancy, so that they can continue to maintain their DAU and get more people in, so that they can continue to earn more money to produce more content in the future. And it doesn't really matter whether it's officially made marketing or just something fan-made, word-of-mouth stuff that also helps to expand the company's name. Because the thing with marketing is that it not only helps the company to get in new people, but depending on the type of marketing that you're doing, it's also a very good way to give assurance to the players within the player base that your game is something that they can rely on to do well. For example, have you ever wondered why in this modern day and age, if you were to go to somewhere like Akihabara, you would see almost every single ad there is either by MiHoYo or YoStar, or DMM sometimes as well. It's not for the sake of getting new people to play their games, right? They're putting up these ads, these huge ads in areas like this, where you can really see prominently in the heart of Weebland that these games are something that are being advertised, because they want people, particularly the people who play their game, to see these ads and think,
"Damn, this game is doing so well that it can advertise even in places like this."
like, I actually did speak to the marketing people in many of the companies I work for, the different game companies, of course. And the thing is that one thing they can agree on is that, like, if you were to actually try to put up an ad telling people to play your game, you're actually likelier to drive down your DAU rather than to increase it. Because if you're telling people, hey, we are having an event, please play our game, you're showing a level of desperation, which is not good for consumer confidence. And so, with many titles out there, doing ads like that tend to hurt your marketing instead. And so many games would rather just put up a PV or something cool, because even though it does not drive up your DAU directly, it helps to maintain your DAU, or at least get people who used to play a game back, even if it doesn't get new people in. So marketing, there are many things that it can do for a game, especially for mobile games where you want to maintain a critical mass of players so that you can keep on producing content. And as I mentioned before, with the success of the global and KR servers, they now had a huge amount of money on hand, and you could really see this money being invested into many of these, right? They did improve the game quite a bit. You started to see less bugs, the QOL was a lot better than it used to be. Like some of the features that make the game more convenient and more playable nowadays, but also on top of them trying to improve the game that they had on hand, as well as to try to treat their players better, you also started to see a much bigger marketing push as well. And you can see this through all of the different ways they have been trying to promote the game online as well. You started to see them creating more 3D character models for use on their YouTube channel, ones for Aru, Hifumi, including the ones for the April Fool's thing, I believe. And you also started to see an improvement in the quality of their PVs as well. That said, for all of this, while they were starting to put in a lot more effort into it, you didn't really see a marked improvement in the game's success even up till then. It was only until a little later, during the summer event, where a certain pink-haired girl appeared. And no, I'm not talking about the horny pink one, I'm talking about the... Wait, no, that... Okay, look, I'm not talking about the two horny pink ones, I'm talking about the one from the year before. You guys know the one. You do know the one, right? Come to think of it, pretty much all of the anniversary characters other than Wakamo have had pink hair, huh? I guess you could really say this is a pink archive. Did I ever mention that pink is like the horny color in Japan? But yes, it was during this period, during the summer of 2022, where you really did start to see a marked increase in the amount of marketing that they were doing. For one thing, this was when they started to ramp up most of their whole YouTube Shorts thing that they have been doing. Prior to the June of 2022, you really didn't see many at all. I believe their channel only had like 2 or 3 shorts, and then it was during July where you started to see the Yuka series come up, and it was from there on where you started to see them pretty much uploading YouTube shorts almost weekly. It was during this summer as well where you also started to see a marked increase in the amount of stuff like PVs that they were actually pushing on their channel. And this year that you really started to see an increase in the amount of success that they were getting in terms of reach with their marketing. Most of their shorts were somewhere around 700,000 views, I believe. And during that period, YouTube was also a lot more aggressive in trying to push this feature as well. So in terms of the algorithm, probably doing them a lot of favors as well. But even then, all of this, while it did start to get their name out there into the public, it still wasn't one of the biggest things, I would say, during that period, which caused the game to go as viral as it did. Rather, it was all thanks, at least in my opinion, to Okay, maybe that was a little too hyperbolic, because for sure, they also did release the 1.5 anniversary short animation during that period as well, and that did manage to garner quite a lot of views. Today it sits at 1.5 million. The Yuka ASMR also did get a lot of views, although to be fair of this too, the Yuka ASMR doesn't feel like something that would really appeal to people outside of the fan base, although it might have gotten viral just because of the fact that just releasing an ASMR was so strange at the time perhaps. And for the 1.5 anniversary animation, to be fair, if you're really into animation, you probably realize that it was quite rough around the edges. It was nice to watch, still. First time they ever did something like that, so to be fair, it's fine. But at the same time, it is true that that may have also played a big part in showing people that, hey, you know, we do have money, we are doing well enough to want to do this to celebrate the 1.5 anniversary, even though we didn't do anything during the first anniversary, so this might have been another big way for them to attempt to push the fact that the game was doing well and to get people to try out the game after seeing the interesting stuff within the animation as well. But at the same time, we cannot deny the fact that the Hoshino memes were actually pretty big in terms of how far and how big they got. You look at the videos made about them, they reached like hundreds of thousands of views overall. One of them even got close to 1 million. And if you go on to Nico Nico Doga, the Japanese equivalent of YouTube, you will also notice that even there, the videos were doing pretty well and they were actually released quite early into July as well. And the reason why I'm putting more emphasis on this instead of on the corporate side stuff that they produce is due to the fact that in spite of the fact that they have released multiple PVs in the past, both for like story arc releases and everything, which all seem kind of successful, like when the first Rabbits like chapter released, you look at the ones for Ariel's squad as well. They do very well, but when you look at the actual statistics, the data of that period of time, you really notice that the DAU, the revenue, nothing really shifts much. And so when it came to the 1.5 anniversary, the thing that felt like the biggest anomaly among all of the stuff that happened during the period of time would quite likely have been the fact that this meme, this completely random pink hair girl meme, went so viral during the period that it did. And it's because of this that it might have caught on, particularly among many of the artists, especially on Twitter, which would then play into what made the game even more popular later on, I would say. To be fair, I'm not saying the marketing did everything for the game during this period, right? The devs were hard at work, they did do a lot to make sure that the game was better, and so when all of this marketing kicked in, the fluke with the pink hair funny talk girl, everything, when it pulled in people, they would come in and find a game that was more enjoyable than what they used to have before. Right, you look at the core game itself, they've been improving it, the game was more fun and more balanced, more stable especially than it used to be initially. The amount of stuff they gave out to attract people and to keep people staying in the game during the 1.5 anniversary, very good. Very much of an improvement compared to the first anniversary. They gave out like what, 100 pulls instead of the 1 pull a day? That's a very huge jump. When it came to QOL as well, they refined a lot of stuff. They looked at the issues with the game and they tried to improve it such that people would have a better time. They did do their part, and it's because of this, the fact that when they got all of that money coming in, they didn't just like take it and book it, but instead use it to both advertise the game and improve the game as it was at the time. It was quite a large part of why, in my opinion, it became such a success starting from that period onwards. Because really, July was the biggest and most successful month they have had since the very first month of release at this point. But what is more impressive than that is the fact that from this point onwards, somehow, this month, which had become the most successful month they have had since their launch, would become their 4th lowest performing month up till today. Yeah, it actually jumped that much. We're gonna go into it right. There is no break because there is no ads with this, but we'll be going to it right now. The next big jump after this, 3 months later, if you look at the Sports Day event. Now, I'm sure those of you who played the game, you know that there were some issues with it at the start. But even then, this was another event where not only did they hype it up a lot, but they did push it quite a lot in terms of the advertising. And they actually did something that was quite respectable as well later on. First and foremost, when it came to the advertising, this was also the period where they actually released a lot more videos as well, like all the 3D animated ones for the Sports Day event itself. And what can I say? You look at the Hasumi PV, right? Like, You can tell that they were trying their best to target certain groups of people, and by God did they succeed, to be honest. Well, she might have been a free character release for the event. You had her, you had Yuka, quite popular, you had Mari, also relatively popular, something about nuns, people have a king for that. In the level to which they hyped it up, hey, it actually did work. DAU actually spiked again during this period. Like, if you were to look at the DAU graph, it was really a case of you see a spike at summer, during the Hoshino event, it goes back down in terms of the actual downloads, although the DAU saw a marked increase of about 100,000. You reach the sports event and just see another big spike. What can I say? People really do love their titties. But of course, during this event, there was a very big issue, which was that when they announced the rewards for the event during the live stream, I believe, there was a lot of backlash. People were saying this event is shit, you know, like it does not live up to the hype that they had made for how much they wanted this event to be a big thing. Like, even though this wasn't a anniversary thing or anything, this was something that they wanted to have that would be big in and of itself. And the public perception at the time, at least within the people who played the game, was that it did not really live up to what they were saying it would be. And you know what they did? They actually took that information and they were like, yeah, you know what? We're just gonna give out free shit. Why not? You know, we failed at trying to make this thing good. We're gonna revamp the event itself, and we're just gonna give you all free shit. Those of you who played during that period, those of you who played in like global as well, you probably already had the event as well. Like you saw it. It's like you just suddenly get a shit ton of Hasumi fragments, and now you just have a max Hasumi for no reason at all. Instead of just going silent or doing the Diablo thing where you just go like, what, come on, you all have phones, right? Blame shifting. A true girl boss trait. They actually took the criticism to heart and tried their best to do right by their player base. Even if it was not like a calculated marketing move, right? If they genuinely believed it from the bottom of their heart that this is something that they should have done, because when you look at the people, the developers of the game, the way they talk about the game, you can tell that they really do care about this thing that they make, right? It is stuff like this where they set themselves apart from many companies out there, where they actually show that, hey, you know, they listen, and not just to the titties that you want to have in the game, but actually overall in terms of feedback from the players. And they do try to improve it as well. So when the event itself actually released, yeah, actually did pretty well. You look at the sales figures, you look at the DAU. Yeah, sales for October, actually the highest it's been, even higher than the Hoshino event. And that was already a pretty big event at the time. Yeah, it really was a lot bigger. Like, I'm looking at the values now and it's like 1.5 times perhaps, about there. Like this, remember, we're not even talking about an anniversary or 1.5 times anniversary, but this event, it almost matched their first month's release. I mean, maybe because of the fact that they released the Yuka ASMR, it kind of just like incepted in the minds of the people that like when Yuka comes out with her exposed thighs, you gotta roll as hard as possible. You look at all the other games out there, like maybe Genshin, it's an exception, FGO, right, Puzzles and Dragons even now, like it's okay, maybe not Puzzles and Dragons, that one is slowly declining, but you look at many of the successful titles nowadays. Like, this is something that I don't think Nikkei has been able to achieve. To be fair, Nikkei, its launch was so explosive that getting back to that might be difficult. It's very rare, and it's very impressive to see, to be honest, like, looking at it. Like, I know this is all estimates, and I'm just looking at my own estimates and giggling to myself like I'm some kind of crazy person here, but, you know, no, the data should be relatively accurate, and looking at it, it's really quite impressive that like it actually did do this well. You know what's even more insane though than the fact that they just managed to almost beat their first month's sales in just this random month alone? How well they did at New Year's. During January itself, there was the second anniversary celebration, the event that was held in Akihabara at one of the very small buildings there. I get the feeling that because of how big the game's jump in popularity was, it was very hard for them to take stock of how popular the event would be. But like, I did make a video of me going down to it as well. The event, the queue was 2 fucking hours long the entire day through. The fact that this event was getting so big to the point that you basically had people queuing for like hours like this in the heart of Akihabara. In and of itself, aside from like all the stuff that was within the hall, which already made it entertaining enough, like just seeing people queue to that extent outside of the event, inadvertent, people were suffering, not the best, but it definitely drew eyes to the series as something that was slowly getting very big. Plus, you also did have the Mika banner, which you guys know, I don't need to say how strong she is in the game, like, a little bit, game meta, broken stuff, whatever. Very big release, It's no wonder January did that well. The event started on the last week of January and ended before the turn into February. Because of the Mika banner, you also had like 2x rate up, which was 6%, no longer the 5% at the first anniversary. Very cool when you think about it. So obviously February wasn't gonna match it in terms of sales in game, although to be fair, I would say that the stuff they did outside of the game probably brought them a lot more money than anything that they could have gotten from just more banners within the game as well, because February was when they did the whole Akihabara Jack thing, or basically where they did the entire event that was like an entire scavenger hunt across most of Akihabara at the time. And I made a video about that one. You can go and like give that a watch as well if you want to see like what was going on during that period. There's a lot of stuff. Like they were even having collabs with like the model gun shooting ranges, many of the stores around there. I think there were like even 2 pop-up stores within the month of February as well, one with Animate and one at, don't remember where it was, I think it was at Atre. Because of this event, it really did push this series even more. Like, you got all the good free stuff that was being given out within the game as well. That's pretty cool. But on top of that, they did probably one of the biggest marketing things I've seen in a while, especially when you consider the fact that like after the pandemic, most places, most companies were still pretty averse to trying to go into like this outdoor marketing back into like stores, fronts and all of that. Like this Blue Archive one, the interesting thing was that in a way it was being paired together as some kind of Akihabara revitalization campaign as well, which means that it had the double bonus of not only being a big event that could promote the series itself, but it also became a big sign of like the companies trying to push to get Akihabara back to where it was as well. So for the first big major thing to happen in Akihabara after the pandemic, like restrictions were lowered, I would say that this did a pretty good job of just like getting eyes onto the series as well. But yeah, at this point I get the feeling that there will have been no doubts in the mind of anyone within the industry that this game had pulled off one of the biggest comebacks in mobile, especially gacha gaming history, to be honest. Like when we get on from this period onwards, it only got bigger and bigger to the point that at this point, looking at it in January of 2024, it actually looks like even more of an anomaly, to be honest. Because what happened was that by the time you got to summer of 2023, not only did this game manage to triple the sales that it had on its initial launch month, but it also was the series to have the most number of doujin circles at Comiket. Many of these circles that I followed that did stuff for like FGO, like many other series, official artists who did stuff for like Nanoha and all that, like all of them suddenly were just going all in onto Blue Archive as well. It beat out Hololive, beat out FGO, beat out Genshin, it beat out every other big IP at the time. I would say that considering the people who were working in the Blue Archive team, I guess in a way it was a long time coming that this would happen. Like, look, the people who make up the team, right, the development team of Blue Archive, they're all Kumers as well, right? They're all big degenerates, and I say that with the most amount of respect, right? Like, they know and they actively are the kind of people who go to Comiket, and they know like what, as a result, most likely would do well there. And when you listen to the people in the dev team talk about the character design for Blue Archive, why they made the decisions they did, the focal points of the art design and all of that, you really get a sense that these people are very, very skilled at hitting the pinpoint kinks that you know that many people out there have. They know what people look out for, and they try to incorporate that into their art to basically hit the strike zones of many people who typically may not find many games that hit that specific kink that they have an interest in, while simultaneously also being able to make some really wholesome and cute stuff. Like, there are many parts of the game that just feel so wholesome or well written that it just makes me feel like this game doesn't really need the Kumarish sides of it at times. And this makes it even easier for people to want to get into making doujin stuff for it. And in a way, whether inadvertent or not, this actually gave the game even more popularity, because now people in general just started talking about it because of the fact that this game that just like dark horse out of nowhere is suddenly the game with the most number of circles at Comiket, beating out even titans like FGO. And then that more or less brings us to where we are today, right? Like 2.5 anniversary, picked at almost triple the original first month of release. Like the game at this point had steamrolled so far ahead that the nightmare that was the first year of release, it looks like a dream to that. Like it feels like a myth of a bygone era, like the Dark Ages, that people just wouldn't believe, like, I feel like if they weren't here for the initial launch, like how bad it was doing at that time, to be honest. But yeah, that's where we're at now. Unfortunately, I don't have the data from January of 2024 itself, since we're still in the middle of it. By the time I'm recording this, we're barely into 2024, so that data doesn't exist, so I unfortunately can't use it to show how well the game is doing this month at least. But suffice to say, it has pulled quite a miracle up to this point. December Comic Cat was the second Comic Cat in the row where Blue Archive was basically the series with the most number of circles, and I'm not sure if like it's gonna be the same as well next summer. We'll have to see. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that's happening now, right? We thought Anniversary, they're taking an even bigger location, this time not in Akihabara, but in Odaiba. I think it's the same place where the HoloLive Expo event takes place as well, so relatively large location. The balloting sold out pretty hard. There are a lot of things going on within the month. We'll have to see how the third anniversary goes, but suffice to say, the game, it just blew up and it just never looked back ever since the 1.5 anniversary. But yeah, overall that catches us back up to today. Probably by the time this video goes up, it's the third anniversary already. If so, I'll probably be over there instead of here, so hey, hope you guys are doing well from me from the past. But when it comes to this game, it really was quite a miracle, and still is, how far it has gotten when you compare to how horrible its launch is. Once again, just like not to like harp the point, but like the fact that this game managed to pull off the level of success it did when its launch was that miserable, it's truly a very rare sight. It feels like nowadays, especially in this climate where game companies are doing worse than they ever have before because of the fact that many are just like collapsing a little, just a little bit, after the pandemic ended and their sales started to fall a little. That many mobile titles, especially gacha games, would try to end servers within the first year. Like there have been many in the past few months, in the past year in fact, that they didn't even bother trying to go past the first year because of the fact that it is easier to just cut it off if it's not successful than to just try to push on with it. So the fact that in spite of everything that happened, this title pushed on, well done, very well done. Like, as someone within the industry, even though I don't work on mobile games anymore, it's still pretty cool to see that like something like this could actually happen. And I don't know if we'll see another like miracle like this happen again for years to come, in fact, especially when you consider how saturated the mobile game market is nowadays. But suffice to say, their efforts to try and improve this title in spite of how shaky its launch was, it all paid dividends in the end, and you really have to thank both the dev team for all the work they put in, the pink-haired, funny-speaking girl who somehow caused some level of virality, the big titties that did so as well, and you guys, the ones watching this video, especially if you're in global or KR, which are probably the people who actually would have a better ability to understand what I'm saying. You guys are a large part of why this game, in my opinion at least, actually is as successful as it is today. Because without that injection, that big success that Global and KR was on release, I don't think this game would have had the funds nor the patience on the publisher's side to continue to this point. Although that's just a theory. A game theory. Okay, no, okay, we're not doing that. But yes, one thing is for sure, at this point, and this kind of feels like I'm doing the thing from that one virtual insanity. I'm going insane. I think smacking myself in the face probably did something to my brain a little, but thank you guys for watching. I get the feeling this video is gonna end up unintentionally being way longer than I initially planned it out to be. Like, I started on this endeavor thinking that this would be like a 15-20 minute video. I don't know how long this is gonna be yet. My recording time over there tells me that I have almost like, what, 2.5 to 3 hours of recording. So this might become excessively long. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. Thank you once again to Rocio as well as Ranyakumo for all the support you have provided to the channel up to this point. And thank you to everyone else for watching this video as well. But yeah, next video I'm doing, I don't know if I'm gonna do another one this month. No, I have to, because like I kind of want to at least make the third anniversary video at least 1 week after it, before we get into February, and then I'll probably be doing a lot of different stuff in February as well. If there's anything interesting in terms of events like related to all the Blue Archive stuff as well, I'll probably do something there. But aside from that, I'll probably be doing videos on other events that happen within Japan, right? Like Comitia, like the Comiket one just before this, as well as videos about the game industry in Japan. Like I'm planning a series of videos at some point to just talk about the industry and where it is today, but it's gonna take a little bit more time. Maybe I'll get the first video out by like the first quarter of the year, hopefully. We'll have to see. I still need to file my taxes manually since I just changed companies recently, so that's gonna take up a little bit of time. I have a lot of stuff I need to get done. But that's it. Thank you all for watching. If you like the video, feel free to like and subscribe. I'm planning to put the outtakes from some of the Kosoge videos that I do, because I do videos talking about like the very shitty games within Japan across the years as well. So if you're interested in that as well, or you're interested in any of the things I talked about, if you subscribe, you'll probably get a notification if you click the bell button, which I don't know if it still does anything today, which might give you more information about what I'm doing as well. But yeah, okay, I feel like this video the recording has taken me a lot of time and I feel like editing it's gonna take a lot of time. You guys probably tired after watching this entire video, probably sick of hearing my voice as well, so I'll leave you guys here. Thank you all for watching once again. And until next time, take care and bye-bye.